King Charles III just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally breaking a silence he had guarded for 3 long and agonizing years, stepping before the cameras with the weight of a sovereign who has carried a secret too heavy for one man to bear alone. In a moment no palace strategist could have predicted, no courtier could have prevented, and no historian could have anticipated, the reigning monarch shattered decades of Windsor tradition by revealing the existence of a sealed private instruction left behind by his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, an instruction so devastating in its implications, so calculated in its foresight, and so ruthlessly precise in its conditions that it would rewrite the future of the British crown in a single afternoon. He had sworn upon his mother's coffin, sworn upon the sacred oath of coronation, sworn upon the very sovereignty he inherited, that he would never speak of what she had entrusted to him in those final trembling weeks at Balmoral. And yet, standing beneath the gilded ceilings of Buckingham Palace with a cream-colored envelope trembling in his aging hands, the king was preparing to break every one of those solemn vows, because a catastrophic institutional collapse had finally forced his hand. What exactly did Queen Elizabeth predict about the monarchy's darkest hour in the years following her death? Why did she explicitly forbid Charles from acting upon her final wish until 3 specific conditions were met? And what dark hidden tragedy inside the palace walls finally compelled the king, at 76 years old, to fulfill a promise that would cost him the very throne he had waited a lifetime to occupy? The morning had begun as an ordinary one at Buckingham Palace, or so the palace machinery had wanted the world to believe. A pale November light spilled through the mullioned windows of the king's private study on the first floor, catching the dust motes that danced above the mahogany desk where 3 generations of British monarchs had signed the documents that shaped the empire. Outside, a biting cold gripped London, the kind of November chill that seeped through the ancient stone walls of the palace, and reminded every inhabitant that this was a fortress first and a home second. The Persian rugs were freshly beaten, the Van Dyck portraits gleamed under the soft golden light of chandeliers, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing second with the same relentless precision it had marked for over 200 years. And on the desk, beneath the king's trembling fingers, sat an object of mystery that only 3 living souls had ever seen. A cream-colored envelope, edges yellowed with the passage of time, sealed with crimson wax bearing the private cipher of Queen Elizabeth II, a cipher used only for documents she had considered too dangerous to entrust to the official palace archives. The wax seal was unbroken. It had remained unbroken for 3 years, 7 months and 11 days, ever since the late Queen had pressed it into Charles's palm in the final hours before her death at Balmoral. And now, as the king ran his aging thumb across the crimson wax, he knew the moment had finally arrived. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the sleepless hours of his reign, in the quiet chambers of Clarence House, in the cavernous, hauntingly quiet library at Sandringham where his mother had once read to him as a boy. He had imagined the words he would speak, the composure he would maintain, the aristocratic dignity he would carry as he broke a silence that had eaten at his soul for over 3 years. But now, sitting alone in his study with the envelope trembling before him, Charles felt none of that composure. He felt only the crushing weight of a promise made to a dying woman, and the terrifying knowledge that fulfilling that promise would end everything he had spent his entire life preparing to become. His voice, when he finally spoke to the empty room, came out growly and weighted, cracked with the emotion of a son who had waited too long. For 3 years, the world has spoken for her, he whispered to the silent portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace. Today I am speaking for her. And with those words, the final decision of his public reign began. It had been on the 14th of August, 2022, just weeks before her death, that Queen Elizabeth had summoned Charles to her private sitting room at Balmoral. She had been frail then, her hands trembling as they held the teacup, but her eyes had held that same razor-sharp clarity that had governed the Commonwealth for 70 years. Charles remembered the scent of white gardenias in the vase by the window, the rhythmic click of his own Oxford shoes against the wooden floor, the chime of the grandfather clock striking 3 in the afternoon. He remembered how his mother had reached for his hand with a strength that belied her failing body, how she had pressed the cream-colored envelope into his palm, and how she had spoken words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Charles, my son, you have waited longer than any Prince of Wales in our history, but there may come a day when waiting itself becomes the greatest threat to the crown. When that day comes, and only when that day comes, you must open this letter and do what must be done. She had paused then, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that had made him tremble. Promise me, Charles, promise me that you will place the institution above yourself, as I have done every day of my reign, as your grandfather did before me. Promise me that you will not hesitate when the moment arrives, no matter what it costs you personally. And Charles, kneeling before his dying mother, had made that promise. He had made the promise that would now, 3 years later, force him to surrender the throne he had waited 74 years to inherit. Down the corridor, in an adjacent chamber lined with red damask and dark oak paneling, Sir Alistair Whitmore, the king's most trusted archivist and the only palace official who knew of the envelope's existence, was pacing with visible tension. His clipboard was clutched so tightly in his hands that his knuckles had turned white, and beads of sweat glistened along his hairline despite the November cold. For 3 years, Whitmore had guarded the secret of the sealed instruction, had maintained the encrypted communication channels that would carry the king's decision to the necessary parties, had ensured that no leak, no whisper, no accidental disclosure could reach the ravenous British press. But now, as the encrypted satellite feed hummed to life in the adjacent broadcasting suite, Whitmore knew that the machinery of the palace was about to be tested as it had never been tested before. 20 million people would be watching live within the hour. The nation held its breath without yet knowing why. And across pubs in Edinburgh, across breakfast tables in Cardiff, across office desks in Manchester and Belfast, pint glasses and coffee mugs would soon freeze mid-air as the king prepared to deliver an announcement that would rewrite the constitutional history of the United Kingdom. But before any of that could happen, Charles had one final decision to make. He had to break the wax seal. He picked up the silver letter opener that had belonged to his grandfather, King George VI, the same letter opener that had cut open the declaration of war in 1939, the same letter opener that had opened the abdication papers of Edward VIII, the same letter opener that had for nearly a century been used only for documents that would change the fate of the British crown. He held it above the crimson wax, and for a long moment his hand refused to move. He was terrified, not of the letter itself, not of the words his mother had written, but of what those words would demand of him. Because Charles Philip Arthur George, King of the United Kingdom and the 15 Commonwealth realms, had known for months what his mother's letter contained. He had known since the first scandal had shaken the palace, since the first polls had shown public confidence in the monarchy plummeting to historic lows, since the first whispers in the corridors of Westminster had begun to question whether the crown itself could survive another decade of institutional decay. He had known, and he had delayed, because part of him, the human part, the part that had waited a lifetime for this throne, could not bear to release what he had only just begun to hold. And then the wax cracked. The sound was small, almost inaudible, but to Charles it echoed through the study like a gunshot. The crimson seal split cleanly down the middle, revealing the folded parchment within, and as the king unfolded the letter with trembling fingers, he saw once again the elegant, slanting handwriting of his mother, the handwriting he had known since childhood, the handwriting that had signed his birthday cards and his coronation invitations and his mother's final Christmas message to the nation. His eyes filled with tears before he had read a single word. The letter was dated the 3rd of August, 2022. It began with a simple salutation, "My dearest Charles," and what followed would obliterate every remaining certainty the king had held about his own reign. Queen Elizabeth, in the final weeks of her life, had committed to paper a private assessment of the monarchy's future that no palace historian, no royal biographer, no constitutional scholar had ever suspected existed. She had written of her deepening concern about the institution's long-term stability, of the scandals she had watched erode public trust year after year, of the fractures within the royal family that had begun to widen after her sister's death and had only accelerated with each passing decade. And she had written, in the clearest and most unflinching prose Charles had ever read from her hand, that she believed the future of the British crown rested not with her eldest son, but with her grandson. Prince William, she had written, represented a more modern and relatable future for the crown. He could protect the institution while strengthening its connection with the public in ways that Charles, through no fault of his own, could not. Charles set the letter down for a moment, unable to continue. His breath hitched, his hands trembled, and a single tear traced its way down his weathered cheek. He had always known, in the quiet corners of his soul, that his mother had harbored these thoughts. He had seen it in the way she had watched William with a certain fierce protectiveness during the final years of her reign, the way she had insisted on William attending state functions that had traditionally been reserved for the Prince of Wales, the way she had spoken of William's future with a certainty that had at times made Charles feel invisible in his own family. But to see it written, to see it committed to parchment in his mother's own hand, was a devastation he had not prepared himself for. He forced himself to keep reading. The letter continued with the 3 conditions. Elizabeth had written that Charles was not to act upon her wish immediately, not to abdicate in the traditional sense, not to disrupt the natural constitutional order of succession. Instead, she had laid out a precise formula, a failsafe designed with the calculated precision of a monarch who had studied the machinery of the crown for 70 years. Charles was to transfer active leadership of the monarchy to William only if 3 specific conditions were met. First, the monarchy must show visible signs of instability. Second, public confidence must continue to decline over a sustained period. And third, Charles himself must believe, in his own conscience, that delaying the transition would cause greater harm to the crown than executing it. All three conditions had to be met. Not one, not two, all three. And Charles knew, with the crushing certainty of a man who had watched his own reign unfold in real time, that all three conditions had now been met. The past 3 years had been a slow-burn catastrophe for the House of Windsor. The scandals had begun almost immediately after Queen Elizabeth's death, cascading one after another with a ruthlessness that had left the palace machinery gasping for air. There had been the leaked private correspondences, the diplomatic missteps, the fractured relationships between the king and his younger son that had spilled into the international press with humiliating regularity. There had been the health concerns, the whispered speculations about Charles's long-term ability to fulfill the ceremonial demands of the throne, the polls that had shown, month after month, a decline in public confidence that had reached levels not seen since the darkest days of the 1990s. And there had been, most devastatingly of all, the growing sense within the corridors of Westminster and the drawing rooms of the British aristocracy that the crown itself was drifting, that it had lost its moorings, that it needed a new hand at the wheel if it was to survive the 21st century intact. Charles had felt it. He had felt it in every private audience with the Prime Minister, in every state visit that had drawn smaller crowds than his mother's had, in every newspaper column that had questioned whether the monarchy could reinvent itself for a new generation. And he had known, with the terrible clarity of a man who had spent his entire life studying the institution he now served, that his mother's third condition had been met. Delaying the transition would harm the crown. Continuing to grip the reins of active leadership, out of personal pride, out of the human desire to reign after a lifetime of waiting, would be an act of ruthless selfishness that his mother had explicitly warned him against. And so, in the cavernous, hauntingly quiet study of Buckingham Palace, King Charles III made the decision that would define his reign forever. He would fulfill his mother's final private wish. He would transfer active leadership of the monarchy to Prince William, while remaining, in name and in ceremonial function, the reigning sovereign of the United Kingdom. But before he could sign the declaration, before he could set in motion the constitutional apparatus that would reshape the monarchy for a generation, he had to inform the men and women who would be most affected by his choice. And it was here, in the fragile hours between the breaking of the wax seal and the public announcement, that the true drama of the day would unfold, because the palace was not a monolith. It was a labyrinth of competing loyalties, of ancient rivalries, of shadowy operators whose names never appeared in the newspapers but whose influence shaped every decision that emerged from behind those gilded walls. And chief among those shadowy operators was a man known within the palace only as the cabinet secretary of the royal household, a faceless senior courtier who had served 3 monarchs, who wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, who walked the corridors of Buckingham Palace in polished Oxford shoes that clicked with the rhythmic precision of a metronome, and whose cold, calculating eyes had watched every royal drama of the past 40 years unfold without ever betraying a flicker of emotion. He was one of the men in grey, not a royal by blood, not a peer of the realm, not a figure the British public had ever heard of, but an invisible architect of palace strategy, who had for decades operated in the shadows of every major royal decision. And when the news reached him, through the encrypted channels that Whitmore had activated only minutes before, that the king was preparing to fulfill Queen Elizabeth's private instruction, the cabinet secretary set down his clipboard, adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, and moved with terrifying purpose toward the king's private study. The trap had been set, or perhaps, more accurately, the trap was about to be sprung. The cabinet secretary had known of the sealed envelope's existence. He was, along with Whitmore and the king himself, one of only 3 living souls who had known. But he had spent the past 3 years quietly working to ensure that the envelope would never be opened, that the wax seal would remain unbroken, that the machinery of the palace would find ways to delay, to obstruct, to gently but firmly steer the king away from the decision his mother had wanted him to make. Because the cabinet secretary, like many of the shadowy operators who had built their careers within the palace apparatus, understood something that the king in his emotional turmoil had perhaps forgotten. A transfer of active leadership to William would not merely reshape the monarchy. It would reshape the entire ecosystem of courtiers, advisors, private secretaries, and palace operatives whose power depended upon the current arrangement. And chief among those whose power would be diminished was Queen Camilla. In her private apartment on the opposite side of the palace, Camilla had received the news through her own private channels only minutes after the cabinet secretary had received his. She had been sitting at her writing desk, composing a personal letter to a friend in the Cotswolds, when her private secretary had entered without knocking and had spoken 3 words that had drained the color from her face. "It's happening today." Camilla had set down her fountain pen with a precision that belied the storm within her, And she had understood, with the sharp clarity of a woman who had spent 20 years fighting to occupy the position she now held, that everything she had built was about to shift beneath her feet. The transfer of active leadership to William did not, in any constitutional sense, diminish her role as queen. But it changed the balance of power within the palace, and Camilla, who had learned the calculus of palace politics through decades of quiet observation, knew exactly what that meant. Catherine, Princess of Wales, would rise, and Camilla's influence, so carefully cultivated over so many years, would begin its slow and inevitable descent. The nation held its breath. 20 million people were watching the BBC's live broadcast now, though none of them yet knew what they were watching. Millions of screens flickered simultaneously across the United Kingdom, from the pubs of Glasgow to the beaches of Cornwall, from the terraced houses of Yorkshire to the country estates of the home counties. The palace machinery had signaled that a major announcement was coming, but the details had been guarded with a ferocity that had left every royal correspondent in London scrambling for any scrap of information. And in the corridors of Kensington Palace, Prince William was preparing to receive a phone call that would change the course of his life. The antique rotary phone on the credenza in William's private study rang at precisely 11:47 in the morning. William, who had been reading a briefing document with Catherine at his side, felt his stomach clench at the sound. He knew what the call meant. He had known for weeks, perhaps for months, that this moment was approaching, though he had refused to allow himself to fully believe it. He picked up the receiver with a hand that trembled slightly, and when he spoke, his voice came out cracked and quiet. "Yes, father." On the other end of the line, King Charles III, sitting alone in his study with the opened letter before him and tears streaming down his weathered face, spoke in a voice stripped of all sovereign authority. It was the voice of a father, not a king. "William, my boy, it's time. Your grandmother's wish must now be fulfilled." There was a long silence on the line. William closed his eyes. Catherine, sensing what was happening, reached for his free hand and squeezed it with a strength that anchored him to the moment. "Father," William finally said, his voice fracturing like the wax seal on his grandmother's letter. "I don't want this. Not like this. Not while you still reign." And Charles, who had spent 74 years waiting for a throne he was now willingly diminishing, replied with the broken sob of a son who had finally understood what his mother had asked of him. "That is precisely why it must be you, William. Because you do not want it. Because you fear it will appear as personal ambition. Because you love the institution more than you love the power. That is why your grandmother chose you." The call ended with no further words. There were no further words to say. Catherine held William as he stood by the window of their private study, gazing out at the frost-covered gardens of Kensington Palace. She had known this day was coming. She had spent the past 3 years quietly preparing him for it, gently encouraging him to embrace the responsibility his grandmother had entrusted to him while remaining fiercely loyal to his father. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the family, the impossible tension William was now navigating: to accept greater authority without appearing to seize it, to honor his grandmother's wish without dishonoring his father's reign, to rise as the future of the monarchy, while remaining, in every meaningful sense, the devoted son of the current king. "You can do this," Catherine whispered to him, her voice steady, her eyes fierce with the same aristocratic composure that had earned her the trust of a nation. "Not because you want to, but because your grandmother knew you would do it well, and because your father is trusting you to be exactly the man he raised you to be." William turned to her, tears in his eyes, and nodded. He was ready. Back in the king's study, Charles was preparing for the final act. Whitmore had entered the room with the declaration document, a single sheet of thick cream parchment bearing the royal cipher, the constitutional language crafted over the past several months by the cabinet secretary himself, ironically enough, in an attempt to make the transfer of leadership appear as procedurally sound and constitutionally palatable as possible. The cabinet secretary, having failed to prevent this moment from arriving, had now reoriented his considerable talents toward controlling how the moment would be presented to the world. He had crafted the language to emphasize continuity, to minimize the appearance of diminishment, to frame the transfer as a natural evolution of the modern monarchy, rather than as the fulfillment of a private instruction from the late queen. He had done his job well, but he had not been able to prevent the moment itself, and that, Charles knew as he took up his fountain pen, was all that mattered. The king paused before signing. He looked once more at his mother's letter, at the elegant slanting handwriting that had shaped his entire life, at the words that had finally freed him to become the son she had always hoped he would be. He remembered a moment from Christmas 1992, when the monarchy had been reeling from its annus horribilis, when scandal after scandal had shaken the family, when his mother had stood at the window of Sandringham House on Christmas morning and had spoken words that he had never fully understood until this moment. She had said, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds. "The crown is not ours to hold, Charles. It is ours to protect, and sometimes protecting it means loosening our grip." He had been 34 years old then. He had not understood. Now, at 76, with his mother's letter open before him and his eldest son waiting at Kensington Palace for the news that would define his future, Charles finally understood. He signed the declaration. The scratch of the fountain pen against the parchment was the smallest of sounds, but it was the sound that would echo through British history for centuries to come. Whitmore, standing at attention beside the desk, felt his eyes fill with tears. He had served the Windsor family for 31 years. He had guarded this secret for 3 of them, and he had never, in all his years within the palace, witnessed a moment of such crushing and cathartic weight. The public announcement was scheduled for 1 o'clock in the afternoon, precisely 1 hour after the signing. In the intervening hour, the palace machinery moved with terrifying efficiency. Prime Minister was informed. The Cabinet Secretary briefed the relevant constitutional advisors. Whitmore coordinated with the BBC to ensure that the encrypted feed from Buckingham Palace would carry the announcement live to the nation without interruption. And across the Commonwealth realms, from Ottawa to Canberra to Wellington, senior officials were quietly informed that a major statement was imminent, though the details were held back until the final minute. At Kensington Palace, William dressed in a dark navy suit, his tie a deep and dignified burgundy. Catherine stood beside him in a cream-colored dress that seemed almost to mirror the parchment of the declaration document. They would appear beside the king during the announcement, a visual signal to the nation that this was a moment of family unity, not family fracture. William had insisted upon it. He had told the cabinet secretary, in a phone conversation only minutes after the signing, that he would not accept the transfer of authority unless he could stand publicly beside his father as he did so. It was, William had said, a matter of honor. And the cabinet secretary, who had recognized in William's insistence a sign of the very qualities that had made Queen Elizabeth choose him, had agreed without hesitation. At exactly 1 o'clock, the doors of the Buckingham Palace ballroom opened, and the king emerged flanked by the Prince and Princess of Wales. The cameras rolled. 23 million viewers, more than had watched any royal event since the late Queen's funeral, sat frozen before their screens. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses froze mid-air. In cafes across Belfast, conversations died mid-sentence. Even in the corridors of Downing Street, senior civil servants stopped what they were doing and turned toward the nearest television. The nation held its breath. Charles stepped to the podium. He looked older than he had that morning, the weight of the day having etched itself into every line of his face. But there was something else in his expression too, something that had not been there for years. There was peace. He drew a slow breath, and he began to speak. "My fellow subjects, my beloved family, my people across the Commonwealth, I stand before you today to fulfill a promise I made to my mother, Queen Elizabeth II, in the final weeks of her life. It is a promise I have carried in my heart for over 3 years, a promise that has weighed upon me every day of my reign, and a promise whose moment has now, in my judgment and in accordance with her explicit conditions, finally arrived." He paused. The nation waited. And then, with the grayly weighted voice of a son fulfilling his mother's final wish, he continued. "My mother believed, with the wisdom of a monarch who reigned for 70 years, that the future of our crown rests with the next generation. She believed that the modern monarchy must be a bridge between the traditions we cherish and the world that is unfolding before us. And she believed with a certainty that she committed to writing in her final weeks that my son, Prince William, represents that bridge." Camilla, standing in the wings, closed her eyes and did not open them for a long moment. The cabinet secretary, watching from a discreet position at the back of the ballroom, allowed himself the faintest ghost of a nod. It was done. Charles continued. He announced the transfer of active leadership of the monarchy to Prince William, effective immediately. He would remain king, would continue to serve as the constitutional sovereign, would perform the ceremonial functions of the crown. But the day-to-day operations of the monarchy, the modernization efforts, the strategic direction of the institution, would now be led by William. It was, Charles said, the greatest sacrifice of his reign, and it was also the greatest honor, because it was the fulfillment of his mother's final private wish, and it was, in his own conscience, the right thing for the crown he had sworn to protect. He turned then to William, and the two men embraced. It was the embrace of a father who had finally released what he had waited a lifetime to hold, and of a son who had accepted a burden he had never sought. The cameras captured the moment with painful intimacy. A single tear traced its way down William's face. Catherine placed a hand on his shoulder, and in the wings, unseen by the cameras, Camilla wiped her eyes with a lace handkerchief and composed herself with the aristocratic dignity that had defined her every public appearance for 2 decades. She would remain queen. Her role in the family would continue. But the balance of power had shifted, and she knew it. The announcement lasted only 12 minutes, but those 12 minutes would be replayed across the world for the rest of the century. In the aftermath, Buckingham Palace went silent. No further statements were issued. The cabinet secretary quietly returned to his office and began drafting the operational memoranda that would guide the transition. Whitmore returned to his archives, where he carefully placed Queen Elizabeth's letter into a specially prepared vault, sealed with a new cipher that only 3 people in the world would ever know. And in the private chapel at Windsor Castle, King Charles III knelt alone before the tomb of his mother and whispered 5 words that no camera would ever record. "It is done, dear mother." The swallow, in the private symbolism of the Windsor family, had always been Queen Elizabeth's chosen bird. She had spoken of it often to Charles when he was a boy, telling him that the swallow was the symbol of return, of homecoming, of promises kept across long distances. And as Charles knelt in the chapel that evening, the sun setting through the stained glass windows and casting patterns of crimson and gold across the ancient stone floor, he felt something he had not felt since her death. He felt her presence, he felt her approval. He felt, for the first time in 3 long and agonizing years, that his mother could finally rest. Outside the palace walls, the nation was still absorbing what it had witnessed. The newspapers would spend the coming weeks and months dissecting every word of Charles's announcement, every gesture of William's acceptance, every implication for the future of the British crown. The commentators would debate whether Elizabeth's private instruction had been a stroke of monarchical genius or an unprecedented interference in the constitutional order. The historians would begin to reassess the entire arc of Charles's reign in light of what had been revealed. And somewhere in the shadows of the palace machinery, the men in gray would continue their work, adjusting to the new balance of power, cultivating the new relationships, preparing the new strategies that would carry the institution forward into an uncertain future. But for one afternoon, on a cold November day in London, the ruthless machinery of the palace had been overridden by a single sealed envelope, a single mother's wish, and a single son's willingness to place the institution above himself. The broadcast cut to black. There was no music, there was no commentary. There was only a stunned national silence, the silence of a nation that had just witnessed something it would never forget. And in that silence, in the quiet moments after the cameras had stopped rolling and the microphones had gone dead, a truth settled over the United Kingdom like the first snowfall of winter. Queen Elizabeth's final private wish had been fulfilled. Prince William now stood as the active leader of the monarchy. King Charles remained the reigning sovereign. And the swallow, after 3 long years of waiting, had finally flown home. The secret was out. The promise had been kept. And the crown, against all odds, against all scandal, against all decline, had been protected for another generation.